SOAS is very much a place where the world is really seen from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and everyone studies or works on the languages, cultures, and societies of those areas. Just to tell you a little bit about myself and why I did Hindi, I studied English and German in high school. I came to Hindi at university in Italy because I wanted to explore literatures beyond Europe. And for me, world literature, even now, is this sense of curiosity. Is this sense that there's more there than I don't know. Exploration and curiosity. And I have been going to India now for more than half my life. And I call the city of Allahabad, where some of my closest friends are, my second home. And I think I love London because here I can be both European and Indian. India and Europe are here at the same time. Now, I've been interested in literature and multilingualism as it relates to, places and environments. When we say, London is a multilingual city, but also to people, to individuals and their tastes or our tastes. Because often when we set up language barriers, then tastes are what take us beyond those barriers. And part of my project has been to think about world literature, less in terms of centers and peripheries, and more in terms of significant geographies. What are the places? How does the word, not just one world, but what are the geographies? What are the places in the world that are significant for you, for that particular location, for that particular group? And for me, the world then is not just one globe, but is made up of this sort of crisscrossing significant geographies. And so is London, so London is made of so many different geographies. And languages, I think Wenchin said, are also significant geographies themselves. They contain so many different places and worlds even. So for me, being a citizen of the world and of world literature is to be a citizen of many places, not a citizen of none. Anyway, that's enough about me. So our guests are Selma Dabbagh, who was born in the UK, but is of mixed Palestinian heritage, and she grew up in the Gulf, in various places in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia. She's worked a lot of her life with Palestine. She was a human rights lawyer. Her first novel came out in 2002, Out of It, and it was a Guardian Book of the Year. She's also written 2 plays, The Brick for BBC Radio 4 and Sleep It Off, Dr. Schott for WDR Radio in Germany, and several stories. And interestingly, she's currently preparing a collection of prose, poetry, and letters by women of Arab heritage, from the classic to the contemporary period, on the theme of love and lust, entitled We Wrote in Symbols, forthcoming with Sake book next year. Now, Aamer, and she's working on her second novel. Please finish that second novel.
Yeah, just to say the first one was 2012, so I'm not, I am slow, but not, yeah.
Yes, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I got it wrong.
Fine, but thank you. We will finish that second novel.
Yes. Aamer sort of writes and translates across English, Urdu, and Italian. He was born and raised in Karachi, but went to school in India and had family there before moving to England in 1970. He is a graduate of SOAS, and he has been writing since the 1980s. He has published several acclaimed novels. Sorry, Salma, yours I have in Kindle, but here are The Cloud Messenger and Another Gulmohar Tree, and several collections of short stories. And again, here are 2 collections, The Hermitage and Electric Shadows. He's also published, interestingly, and I hope we can get to talk about it, translations of stories by Pakistani women writers. So what is it with women writing that you're both interested in, and teaches literature at City Lit? Wenchin, do you want to say a little bit more about yourself before we start with the question?
Hi, everyone. My name is Wenchin Ouyang. I'm Francesca's colleague, and I have a similar project on multilingualism and word literature. So this is what we share. And in a way, like in many ways, we work quite closely together. We're in each other's projects in and out. But I suppose because our personal journeys and personal relationships with languages are somewhat different, the way we have shaped our sort of like projects are somewhat different. So a little bit about my background, and I don't know whether you can tell that I'm right now in Taiwan, not in London, and I'm away from my books. And usually if I'm on screen, you can't see any books. But today, for the purpose of today's event, I tilted my computer so you can see some of my books here, but I don't think you can tell that I don't have Arabic books or that many English books here, except for the Arabian Nights, of course, but most of the books here are in Chinese. So I am Chinese from Taiwan, but I grew up in Libya and I went to Libyan school, so my first language is actually Arabic. Then I went to New York to do my graduate studies. So my first language, second intellectual language is American English. And then I moved to London, to SOAS in 1997. And now I feel that my English is actually between American and British English. So I have 3 languages. I live in 3 languages, but my relationship with 3 languages is very different. And my geographies with my languages are very different. And I feel in many ways, these languages have become one. Right? So if I speak English or I write English, Arabic comes into it, Chinese comes into it. If I speak Chinese or write Chinese, my other languages come into it. And this is one of the things I have been thinking about in terms of multilingualism. Can we think of any language as inherently multilingual already? And the way I do this is because I have been thinking about how to do Arabic and Chinese comparative literature since I was 19. And because of the variety of paradigms that are available to us, right, it has not been impossible. But if we think about languages as inherently multilingual and culture encounters are inherently part of the language we speak, then can we move beyond and think of word literature as a site of cultural encounters, but a site where different languages meet and become one at the same time, something like this, right? So this is my project. So I have, in many ways, it's about, languages are about exploring, traveling, like Sinbad the Sailor, but it is for me also about homecoming, right? Arabic and Chinese, can I bring Arabic and Chinese together? Something like this. Yes, so.
Good, so we hope in this panel, and again, we hope that also people in the audience will contribute with questions and with their experiences of living across languages, as we say. So as you can see, these are some of the questions that we want to explore. What are our relationships with our different languages? What have been your relationships? What have been, how this comes up in your writing, and your relation between language and place as well. But we would like to start by you reading out something from your work. So Aamer, would you like to start with?
Yes, I'll start with something that I actually wrote in Urdu at the request of my publisher in Pakistan, who said, could you write me a story for a series of children's books I'm doing? And I said, I don't write for children. And she said, well, write about a child. And then another friend, a year later, Shirley Chu, editor of Moving World, said, could you translate a very short story from Urdu into English? I said, but I don't translate myself. She said, well, you'll do it for me. And she translated it bilingually in Moving. I mean, she published it bilingually in Moving World. So it's very short. It's about a child in Karachi, where, as you said, I grew up. So I'm good. I think I can read the whole story. It's very short. So just make a sign to me if I go over time. How did Umar find the blue bead he always carries in his pocket? So listen, this is how the story goes. Umar was 10 when he came back to Karachi after a long time away. His parents had built a double-storied house with a big garden and tall trees on top of a hill in a new residential area. From a corner of the back garden, a narrow path, rocky and flanked by thorny bushes, led down to a market and a huddle of houses. Omar tried a few times to run down the path to buy some things from the market, but stones kept sliding beneath his feet and the thorns pricked his hands. Omar and his parents had arrived in Karachi during the school holidays. Sometimes his cousins would visit, but one of them was 13 and the other was 15, and their hobbies were entirely different from his. They played cricket all day, while Omar enjoyed drawing, climbing trees, and flying colorful kites. He'd spend hours alone in the garden, up in the golden hour tree with his sketchbook or flying his kite. But sometimes he wished he had a companion who'd come over to the house and join him in his games. Then one day he let go of the strings of his kite. It fluttered in the air for a few minutes and came to rest between the branches of a tree on the stony path. Without a thought, he went running down the path in pursuit. The very next minute, his foot caught on a big stone and he fell down among the thorns. When he opened his eyes after a few moments, he saw a face peering at him. A pair of anxious blue eyes met his, and a string of swaying blue beads dazzled his blurred vision. A boy of his own age, dressed in a clean but shabby shirt and trousers, took his hand firmly and pulled him up from among the thorny bushes and the stony path. "Come on, you must get up," the boy said. "But my kite, you'll get that too." After a few steps, they came to a row of houses, but it wasn't the huddle of huts Omar was used to seeing from his garden. This seemed to be a tribal village, with little white houses and the smell of smoke rising from wood fires, and the bread that women in tribal costumes were baking over the fires filled the open air. Omar walked on, his hand in the boy's hand. The boy with blue eyes opened the door of one of the houses and entered. There was a single room, and it was empty. Omar followed him in. "Sit down, my friend," said the boy, and Omar did. Soon the boy came back with buttermilk in a metal bowl and freshly baked bread on a thick white plate. "Eat," he said. Omar drank a few mouthfuls of salted buttermilk and ate a few morsels of fresh bread. The boy was watching him, smiling. Omar's eyes were fixed on the string of blue beads that swayed around the boy's neck. He was overwhelmed by a delicious languor. As if from a distance he heard his own voice, "That's a pretty necklace." And then he couldn't keep his eyes open any longer. When he opened his eyes again, he saw his mother's face looming over him. His limbs felt heavy, and when, with an effort, he raised his head, he saw his foot was heavily bandaged. "What happened to me?" he asked his mother. "You've broken a bone in your foot. I've told you so many times not to play near that path. I've had it blocked now with an iron barrier. But my kite? The strangest thing. A little tribal boy brought you home on his back. He looked shabby but clean. He was staggering under your weight. He'd brought you home from the path with great difficulty. I tried to give him something to thank him, but he ran off. He called out from a distance, 'That was just my duty.' And oh, a few hours later, I found your kite by the garden gate, and one more thing. He placed this in your hand." His mother opened the drawer in the table by his bed and took out a blue bead. "I noticed he had a string of beads like this around his neck," she said. And Omar realized he hadn't even asked his blue-eyed friend his name.
Thank you. Beautiful. You can, I mean, I'm sure that both in Urdu and in English, you have this sense of being taken into another world, and the door is open, and there's the buttermilk and the bead, and it is there are multiple worlds in just one story, aren't there?
Yeah, we wonder whether he's gone into some kind of dream by seeing the tribal boy, or whether he's been actually transported to another world and come back.
Salma, do you want to read your piece now?
Sure. It's quite different, I guess. Thank you, Aamer. Thank you, Francesca.
Welcome.
So my story is one of the first short stories I wrote, actually. It's 2006, and it's set in Kuwait at the time of the invasion. And it's called Me, the Bitch, and Bastanji. Okay, so on the day itself, it was all over before I'd even woken up. I spent the previous day staring at the house across the road. It was crouched on the ground like a space station poised for launch. Dad had been in a mood with me and had just watched the news and talked a lot on the phone in Arabic about a meeting in Jeddah. I can feel the boredom now radiating from the pages of my sticker-adorned diary. 1990 page-a-day diary. An angry pen has dented the cover into moronic teenage braille. More than twice the age now than I was then, I can still feel it. God damn the boredom of being stuck in Kuwait all summer. The house opposite ejected cars from an underground garage and delivered them onto the road like tapes from a Japanese video. The greased iron entrance slid along the concrete wall without a sound, but the object of my surveillance, coded "sh" for Sheikha in my diary, preferred to use the side gate, and I could prefer to use the side gate. From the detective notes I had made, I can see that Sheikha had left and come back twice that day. Her abaya was always black, her face was always covered, her bags were always full of high-class shopping. 010890, 1446, Sheikha reappears in brown Chevrolet Impala, dropped off. 010890, 1624, Sheikha leaves in a blue BMW. My diary also records the movement of 4 Pakistani migrants and 2 Afghanis walking across the wasteland between the blocks of dust-clad housing. If the Afghanis were in fact Pakistanis or vice versa, it was hard to tell from a distance. I had made a note to show that the total was 6. I had also spotted our gardener, Bustanji Abu Walid. Bustanji didn't sweat. Bustanji had leather skin. Bustanji had a head that squeezed out large and burnt from the band of white hair that remained. I liked Bustanji's waistcoat with the cotton pellet buttons and white lining. Polyester fibers shone his back black through the leaves of the eucalyptus trees. 010890, 1724, Bustanji watering plants at their base. I can't remember why we called him Bustanji, which meant gardener, even when we spoke English. Could it be because it emphasized his Arabness? I'm sure Dad just loved the idea of putting earth between the fingers of a fellow Palestinian. It was my friend Nada who had told me, with long, black, flying African arms, although she assured me that the Sudanese were Arabs, not African, and also that they were brown, not black, that there was far more going on in the space station house than I thought. I could tell that she had exaggerated the story, sure, but I didn't care. I needed something to do. I sure as hell was not going to do any revision. Dad was treating me like a child, sticking me in Kuwait all summer. Treat me like a child and I'll behave like one. No revision for you, Dad, and even if I did screw up my exams. When I touched my nose to twist the stud, the scab would loosen itself on the stem. Ow, it hurt so much getting it pierced. Next to the Sheikha's house was a Haji shop where I bought cigarettes. Don't call it Haji, said Nada. That's just what the English do. No, it's not. It's because they've done a pilgrimage, then they come back and they set up a shop. That's rubbish. That's just what the expats say. And you English, don't call me English, I say. Sorry, I forgot. Your mum's what, Romanian or is it Hungarian? Whatever, I say, whatever. Haji had bulging fingers like dog willies, and he didn't look at me when he gave me cigarettes from the shelf, but he kept his neck lolled back to watch the screen while feeling out for dusty notes from the wooden drawer. There were fewer rolling bodies in the trenches by then. Haji was from Iran, but he could as well have been from Iraq because they were both filled their TV channels with pictures of young men blasted limbless or rigid with gas, looped images of bodies and stretched bare tummies and grasping hands in raw earth holes, marching songs and drum beats played over the footage accompanied by the eternal wail of women. My bitch status was normally confirmed to me at least twice on the way back from Haji's shop, and more than that if I stopped for a cigarette. Once, when Nada and I had tried to hide from the road behind a wall of an apartment block, it had come from a woman in Arabic and was accompanied by a bucket of dirty water over our heads. Sometimes they were a joke, the lines coming out of the guys in the car. Hey, baby, do you wear hair gel? Hey, baby, you want to come for a ride? Sometimes the door of the van slid open, fuck trucks, we called them at school. They said there was a bed inside, but I never looked. Head down, walk on. Hey, sexy, way down with accents. Sometimes the words were a blur of consonants. Sometimes it was just a horn, but it was always there as an undertone, as an overtone, ever since I was a kid, even if there was no skin showing at all. It was always there. Bitch, hey, bitch, yeah, I can see you, bitch. On the day itself, Dad had heard the radio cut out in the early hours and when he was shaving, and later told me that it reminded him of what used to happen when there were coups, like the one he had experienced in Syria. I thought it sounded cool to live through coups. I'd seen pictures of my dad, aged 16, walking around in Damascus with his friends looking dandy in fake Ray-Bans. Dad had then noticed that the phones were dead too. That was at about 7. He also saw swarms of helicopters in the sky. How did you know the phones were dead? I asked, because I was thinking like a detective. And he replied, because I tried to call your mother. And I had not expected that. I hadn't expected him to say anything like that, because I didn't think he was ever going to speak to her again. But when I had woken up after all this had happened, to find Dad sitting on the end of my bed looking agitated, I had of course assumed that he'd found my cigarettes or the letter I'd written to Nada, and I remember thinking, this is all I damn need right now. So I was a bit excited, if I'm honest, when he told me that the Iraqis had invaded. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Wenqin, do you want to start?
Okay. All right. Sort of like these are interesting stories, right? Because they're written in English, right? But they are sort of like saturated with other languages. So I want to ask you about your relationship with the languages, with the various languages that you know very well, you master, you speak, or you use, or very little, or this and that, whatever languages, right? And I also want to ask you about the places that you have been, and whether being in one place changes the relationship you have with your languages. So one way of thinking about it is, say, we all use English, right? We're in London, we assume that English is our first language, right? And do we subordinate other languages? So if we say English is our first language, do you think in terms of, well, I have a mother tongue or father tongue, and does that kind of relationship change if you move around? Let's say move out of London, go to Karachi, and Selma, if you go to Gaza, or if you go to Kuwait or Saudi Arabia, for example. Shall we start with you, Aamer?
Yes.
Do you want?
Yeah. Why
Shall we
don't
start with you then, Selma?
Yeah, I mean, just until Aamer's thing. I mean, for me, I mean, I think I've mentioned before, it's my English is my, it's my primary language. My other languages are much weaker than I like. And I think that Arabic is something that I became much more interested in later on. Actually, the sort of time period reflected in this story was really a very key turning point. The political events and everything that happened after was a key point in changing my interest in Arabic and the Arab world, because I'd known it at a very international school, which was an English school, which had within it, I would say, a bit of a sort of an aversion to the Arabic language. It was something which was very much downgraded, which was sort of put across as being like the government's studies for the curricula, something that wouldn't get you anywhere. If you were somebody with, ambition, it wasn't, your Arabic studies isn't where you were going to be putting any focus. And I wasn't, although my dad made lots of efforts for us to have, tutors and to try and speak it at home. I think when you're talking earlier about father tongue, it's very difficult, I think, for the father of the family to pass on a language. And I found it again with my own children. I married somebody who is Palestinian, but the language is dominated so much by the mother, because the father comes home and he wants to create a relationship with the child. He doesn't have as much time, so they'll switch. So I love hearing Arabic now in a way that I didn't really when I was younger, because I was so desperate to get out of the place where I was living, which was Kuwait. And I was ambitious. And I felt I very much identified with my English side, and I think also the fact that I was female, which is this constant idea of being sort of sexually harassed and being viewed in a certain way. I was very uncomfortable, meant that the West was a much more attractive place, and I didn't feel very much loss in not having Arabic at that stage. So does that answer part of your question?
But did you find at any point that Arabic, you had more Arabic than you thought you had, in other you know, because of course, I mean, being there, like I imagine with Bustanji, you would speak.
I think,
for, you know, you would have it all around you, wouldn't you? And so you as well.
There was, but I mean, the weird thing about the Gulf, you know, is that it's very English dominated in the public space. Any interaction, because of all these nationalities, I'm all peppered throughout the story. It's just you constantly dealing with each other in English. So it wasn't like living in Lebanon or Syria or Palestine or Egypt, where you have a strong, where everything is done by people from that country. It's very stratified, so that different nationalities had different sort of levels of job associated with them. And it wasn't, you wouldn't have a transaction in a shop in Arabic, you know. So the Arabic I came out with was really minimal. I could read and write, and I knew some obscure Yafawi nursery rhymes from my dad and a couple of expressions, but really quite little, I would say.
So can I follow up? But has moving to London changed that relationship? I mean, I noticed that you're much more interested in Arabic. You're interested in Arabic women's writing, and in your short story Absence, I believe, right? Is it Absence?
Acceptance.
Acceptance. Sorry, Acceptance. I mean, you do go into even the kind of wordplay that you find in Arabic. And I'm intrigued in particular by your reference to a Shidyaq, right? Who was a 19th century figure who was a lexicographer. He was a language genius, but he was also an innovator of Arabic prose and language, right? So I'm just curious about your whether London has changed your relationship with Arabic.
I think several things. One is the invasion of Kuwait and that expulsion of everybody, and also political events and the Palestinian issue, which the first Intifada was going on. So coming back to England, you kind of expected, you had that child, that, you know, adolescent thing, life is elsewhere. You go to England, that's the center, we're in the periphery. There's this thing that people often say in the Gulf, when you get back to the real world, it's like you're almost, there's a thought that you're not living, that life begins. So when you get back there and you realize you don't fit, or as much, that there are other things, that maybe it's something to do with the way that you wave your hands around, or the way that you'll get very involved in political things, or the way you don't understand some codes of conduct that are off, and some things that you're missing. But I think for me, the movement back to the Arab world, because as soon as I graduated, I went to go and work in the West Bank with human rights organizations, was very much a political one. And with that came a lot of the culture and the language. So the Arabic that comes through in my work has been a sort of developing love story, really, of with the language, the place, and a different part of the Arab world, a different way in, that came about later. In terms of in England, I think it's just being through books, through people, through exposure, and it's an odd thing. It's sort of like living in the Arab world made me almost want to get away from it, and then living in London has made me want to go back to it. It's an odd dynamic, I would say.
But that's really interesting, isn't it? With this, instead, the idea that, oh, you know, it has to be, you know, I don't know, it has to be, you know, it's like what you have from the beginning, and then it will only kind of decrease. Whereas the idea that actually your relationship can increase and your language can increase and deepen and broaden, I think that's a very important message for the rest of us. Yeah.
I mean, I've done many years of Arabic lessons since, but it's not fluent. But sorry, I think.
No, go ahead. And what about you? Sorry.
Just absolute last point is something I've been thinking about. Is I think I probably, in terms of identity issues, I think I quite like an outsider status. I mean, there's always a focus on having one complete identity and what are you missing by being from various cultures, but actually I think there's something so sort of enriching about it, and also having that slight distance and having comparatives about ways of dealing with things is an absolute richness to me. And it's only, you know, sometimes you take back these cultures on your own terms later on, I guess. That's my thought.
What about you, Aamer? So what has been your relationships with different languages, in fact, you know, if you think
let's start with English. I went to a Montessori kindergarten and then to school. and to an international school like Selma, everyone spoke only English there. I was also taught by Irish nuns. We were penalized if we spoke Urdu at home, at school, sorry. Mother tried to teach us Urdu at home and get us tutors and so on and so forth. So basically we picked it up from the radio, from songs, which I loved. So now, looking back, I can gather I knew a lot more than I thought I did. When I went to live in India, I spent time with my grandparents and my aunts in smaller towns where Urdu was spoken all the time, and you were considered stupid and dumb and a little crazy if you spoke English all the time. So I had to learn to speak Urdu at least, reasonably well. I also studied Hindi at school, and I found it very easy. So when I came to England, to pick up another part of the question that I think Wenchin asked, I did Hindi for an O-level, I think, within 6 months of arriving here, and I got a B or a C or something like that. I think it used to be A's and C's, so I was good with Hindi. I had lost my Urdu reading and writing skills, but evidently my Hindi was good enough to express myself well enough to do that. I acquired my Urdu reading and writing from the age of 17 onwards, but it was something like a 20-year process really to master it. And today I was sending a voice note to someone I'm sort of supervising for an MPhil, and I was surprised to listen to myself speaking the most kind of academic, or not even really academic, in a high register of Urdu with not one English word. So obviously I have come to a certain kind of ease with it, which makes me, when I'm angry, speak Urdu without a single intervention of another language. I think both things are fine. We can mix languages, but it can annoy me a lot sometimes. And because I love both languages almost equally, we can talk about that a little more later. But I like to speak well in both languages, or to speak clearly and articulate myself well in both languages. Because obviously, I have two different, as it were, groups of people I speak to, those I speak to in Urdu and those I speak to only in English. Most of my friends in this country are English speaking. Shazaf mentioned that we speak Urdu to each other. She's one of the few people that I do speak Urdu to in England regularly and rarely. And it is Urdu that we speak to each other. So yeah, I'm an Anglophone child. And then I became a third culture child because I was in India where, I couldn't speak the kind of Urdu, however rudimentary it was at school. I was in South India and the Nilgiris. So most people's mother tongues were Tamil or Telugu, sometimes Gujarati, sometimes Hindi. But really, I had to read and write Hindi as my second language.
But I'm thinking also sort of culturally what it means for you, So when you came to SOAS to study Farsi and sort of Farsi literature, and then you shifted to Urdu. So
That's right. Yeah.
What did that what did it mean to you? And then how did that come into your writing?
Truthfully, I took Farsi rather than Arabic because it was just much easier for me. I had been absorbing and imbibing Farsi consciously from the age of about 16, I'd say. And that was something that, as I used the word conscious, it became more conscious when I came here because I saw books by poets in Farsi, or classical poets in Farsi. And I had been picking up that kind of poetry, Sadi or Rumi or whatever, since I was a kid, from oral transmissions of it. And then to be able to read it with translations made a big difference. And I thought, this is not going to be that hard for me, and it wasn't. But of course, it enriched me hugely. I don't know to what extent it enriched my English. I'm sure it did. I'm absolutely sure it did. It actually enriched my Urdu when I began to write in Urdu hugely.
Well, Hermitage has a story, one of your latest story collections, a story riffing on Lele Majnoon and then Three Tales after Rumi.
Yeah.
Hanan al-Sheikh asks, are you Rumi's modern sibling? So it's like you're writing,
that is very generous.
But in English, but it is almost like a translation.
No? It is a translation. Actually, I looked at the Farsi, it was in front of me while I wrote. Except that in Farsi, I think some of them are verses, but those ones were actually prose. So I was looking at the Farsi, and then I was looking at French versions of it as well, just to see that I was right. I didn't want to look at anything in English because it would have tainted what I was doing, the quality of the prose. If I did the same thing in Urdu, which I haven't done yet, I would not look at an Urdu translation because the same thing would happen.
So can I come back to you about a question, because I think it's related to the kind of question that Selma was raising, and I'm going to phrase it in a crazy way because I've just thought about it. Is this idea of purity, right? Do you think do you think that's something that you think about when you write, right? That's number one. And the other question that follows is that, do you think of languages in the form of a hierarchy, right? And this is a question that I'm going to ask Selma as well. Hierarchy.
Yep.
So if you
speak no, because I think that my English is probably more influenced by French than by anything else. I think that I then have Italianate sentences. I think Francesca can talk about this very often. And then I have Urdu and Persian metaphors and echoes of poetry from Hindi, a lot, probably even more than Persian. So that you know, we need a critic to count those references, because Hindi oral lore, or you know, the songs of Kabir and Mira and so on, which are never authenticated. We never know when we read written versions of them how authentic they are. So there's that mix. So no, I mean, anything I write is not going to be pure. Likewise, when I write Urdu, I like to use probably as many Persian words as I use Hindi words. I don't use the current Pakistani standard of Urdu, and I certainly don't use words in English for bed or book or anything like that. I see no need to do that. So I don't know if that answers the question.
So I heard you, right, once, and we talked, and you tantalizingly gave us the idea of grandmother tongue. That it's sort of like, can you tell us more about it?
Yeah,
grandmother
I certainly
tongue.
can. Yeah, you see, if I talked about that the other day as Persian, that is literally my grandmother tongue on both sides. That's what they spoke as children and growing up. And I did remember hearing my grandmother recite Rumi and many other things. I mean, she and her sister would gossip to each other in Persian. But actually, I got a lot of Hindi from her and Rajasthani as well. So that's also my grandmother tongue. So that becomes even more complicated. So from my one maternal grandmother, I get this legacy of languages, which is wonderful, because my parents spoke mostly English to each other, but also very, very pure chaste Urdu. My father was Sindhi speaking. I don't speak Sindhi. I don't know Sindhi. I can barely understand a few words. But when they spoke, they switched languages, but each language would tend to be absolutely pristine.
So
I'll go ahead. So just one last question before turning to a question to both of you. So one is, it just to a comment on this, is this why your books or your stories or novels are full of characters who are translating, reading in other languages, you know, writing in different languages, you know, is it a kind of spill off of your own experience, or is it something that you are particularly interested in?
No, I guess it's a spill out of not just my own experience, but my friendships and the people around me. I think very, very few people I know are monolingual. I do know many. I'm sorry, I lie, but you know, when I go back to Pakistan, most people speak 3 languages as a matter of course. And for example, I'll just tell you a little story to finish off what I want to say. A young man stood up and asked me from the audience of a university hall, what language shall I write in? I speak Seraiki at home, I speak Sindhi in my village, I speak Urdu in my university, and I'm doing an MPhil in English. And I said, write the language that you feel most comfortable in. So he's now published 7 or 8 or 9 maybe stories in Urdu. That seemed to be the language that he wanted to write in. Now, when that Urdu is inflected with and mixed with Seraiki or Sindhi, I love it. But when he gratuitously uses English words, I go, you know, I mentor him and I say, get that word out, throw it out. Because people in the villages are not going to be, using some of this language that you're using here. So, yeah, you can protest and argue with me about this. But I like Urdu in Pakistan to have the resonances of the regional languages,
Right.
and the many languages people speak.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't like to lose vocabulary. I feel that, you know, sometimes there's a diminishing of vocabulary because English is coming in through, particularly through email and the language of WhatsApp and Facebook and SMS.
So can I come to you, next Selma, and ask the same question? And then after this, you read, and I see some comments from the audience, so maybe we can turn to those as well. Do you have a grandmother tongue? Can you, I mean, and then languages, did you feel that your languages are necessarily placed in a hierarchy or no? We can't hear you. You're muted.
I am unmuted now, I think. Yeah.
Fine.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of grandparents, I have my father's mother died when I was quite young, and we were in England until I was, well, Saudi in England until I was about 8, so I didn't have as much contact with her. And actually, my only memory of her is her trying to ask for something in the house and not understanding a word. I mean, like, I think it was a basic word like sukkar, you know, for sugar. So that's very, very limited, honestly, on that front. Then my English grandparents we used to stay with in the summer, and yeah, I mean, in terms of hierarchy, my English is way up there compared to my other languages. But I just, a couple of things that came up. One is, I think that as a route back into your language of heritage, I think the role of academic institutions can't, I mean, I also went to SOAS, and I think of all the places I've studied it, I felt very free, very, very much I could be all the things. You didn't have to be one thing. It was a very inclusionary space, and the same with the American University Cairo, American University Beirut, very particular spaces that gave you, I mean, I feel such jealousy for people with better Arabic than mine, you know, it's or fluent Arabic in terms of the amount that I could research, people I could communicate with, the way that it would influence my work. But my hierarchy is very clearly English is up there and my other languages are small. But in terms of how languages informs my writing, I don't really believe in purity of, you know, because if you go into sort of trying to think about what is my pure English, then you start thinking that there are certain topics which are off subject as well. You know, I think we've fought a lot of these battles, but it used to be the idea, and Atwood's talked about this, Joyce talked about this beforehand, that the sort of to be part of the English canon, it had to be something based in London around, you know, sort of gentlemen of a certain sort of class. And all of this you have to kind of push against. That's, I mean, partly why I picked this writing, where this bitch character in Kuwait, she's from no place, she's mixed up, she's not particularly likable, you know, it's just to try and like move the first person narrator to these new growing hybrid characters that are growing up all over the world, who perhaps, you know, we mentioned third culture kids, you know, perhaps location is something they have an option about, you know, nationality, language is part of it, but location and a sense of being.
Okay, actually, Francesca, if it's okay with you, I see a sort of a very interesting question from Ali Arif. Do Aamer and Selma have anything to say about scripts as well? My cousins in Pakistan type Urdu in the Roman script and not in the Perso-Arabic, which I find interesting.
Can I take that? Can I take that question first?
Definitely, you take that one.
Yeah, well, some of that spelling, Ali Arif, is so dreadful. Type krenge, K-R-E-N, nay. The words they type are sometimes incomprehensible, but a lot of them are now using Urdu actually on their mobiles.
Yeah.
I try to answer in Urdu. I have Urdu script on my mobile. I also have Hindi, Francesca. I have both. There's no standard transliteration, but because I studied at SOAS, I use the SOAS transliteration. And also sometimes they write Urdu as they think that English would transliterate Urdu. So they write things that in any other language would be incomprehensible. You know, AY for A, for example, E, which in Italian or Spaniard would read completely differently. they wouldn't understand what was being said or written if they knew Urdu. But I mean, some of the spellings are dreadful, absolutely. And I sometimes don't know what I'm reading. But they're doing it, they're communicating, and that's the language that they also Bowdlerize with English words. You know, put karenge, for example. I mean, I just don't understand even what that means. Really.
But isn't that a way to sort of also, in a way, expand Urdu or, you know, Arabic in that case beyond, you know, we said that pure, you know, some sense of pure or tradition.
At one level, yes. At one level, no, because it diminishes the vocabulary.
No, but I want you to link it actually in both your cases to your interest in women's writing, no? And I thought, you know, it's quite interesting that you studied probably quite the canon, I imagine, at SOAS of Urdu poetry, yes. which is male largely, and then you went to work on women's writing. So what did you find there, both in terms of language and
me?
Really,
right.
and Selma as well. You know, what's your why your current project? But
I have two answers, and I don't want to go on too much about it. But the first answer is that when I read Urdu fiction, some of the best writers were women, and they were just acknowledged as being some of the best writers, not as being women writers. And first among them were Ismet Chughtai and Qurratul and Haider, who were feuding with each other quite a lot of the time, but not as women writers, as great writers. Then I kept on discovering more and more great Urdu women writers. When I went back to the early 20th century, and those books were books I found in the archives at SOAS, some of them were in that stuff that's put away, and I had to, you know, put requests in for it. And there was this, first of all, this bubbling, exuberant, beautiful Urdu that I knew somewhere at the back of my mind, but I didn't know it, you know, as a written language. Muhammadi Begum particularly, it's fantastic. I have a book by my bed now. That was so wonderful. The reason I did the book of women's writing was because Saki, who are now publishing Selma, said, wouldn't it be more interesting if you did women writers? But I did women writers from a very specific time, who were more or less contemporary. They were not women writers of another time. They were also women writers who were all very accessible to a kind of postmodern or modernist taste, which was who I was then, perhaps, when I chose them. It wasn't a retrospective, it was a post-independence collection. But I loved doing it. And what I kept feeling it, why do only 3 or 4 people take precedence, and why do others get pushed behind? On the other hand, I've also protested about that, because once when I was on a platform about 2 or 3 years ago in Islamabad, and 2 writers were being discussed exclusively as women writers, I said, no, they put women at center stage because the world belongs to women as much as it does to men. But the minute you start calling them women writers and talk about them as the greatest women writers of the country, no, they just happen to be 2 of the greatest writers of the country. Nisar Aziz Butt and Samida Riaz, who, as we all know, over the last 20 years, unless you think of Iftikhar Arif, was, you know, just about the greatest Urdu woman poet.
What about you, Salma?
Urdu poets. That, you see, I slipped into that trap as well. She was the greatest Urdu woman poet, but she was just one of the greatest poets. She had a mastery of the language. She could write in dialects. She knew Hindi. She knew all the registers. She was very familiar with English poetry as well, and prose. So, you know, she brought that kind of cosmopolitanism into her writing that you were talking about, and at the same time was wonderful with form and wonderful with traditional form. I'm talking too much, Sasha. Shut up.
That's cool. Well, with the project that I'm working on at the moment, which is an anthology of women's writings, which combines the classical with the contemporary by Arab women writers, part of the idea, I mean, there's so many ideas connected to how it came about, but I mean, if I start from one, which was I read this classical poems by Arab women, which Saki had produced, and for me it was a shocker. I mean, it sounds so anodyne, but the fact that Arab women were writing so early on, you know, like from you know, BC period, some of the figures for the Jahiliyyah, the pre-Islamic period, you know, debatable, but this translator puts some Abdullah al-Udhari at like up to 1,000, 2,000 years before Christ. These letters and poems which talked of, you know, love and sexuality in a very forthright way were astonishing for me. And then the Abbasid poetry and the feeling of the court and this sort of courtly love that is generated there with this sort of law and these letters being passed in Andalusia. And it's this incredibly rich, colourful, assertive world. The women were very powerful. Some of them wanted very much to be independent. And then, so there was that. And then there was a question which was once put to me by a journalist who was interviewing writers at the Edinburgh Festival. And he said, you know, I just interview, you know, I just promote Arabic fiction to the English reading audience. And, you know, we have this, none of my friends will read the books that I review. They just see Arabic literature as being dry. They see it as being very political, colorless, lacking in love stories. So there was this kind of idea that, you know, that in a conception of colorlessness, I mean, you had the whole baggage of Orientalism in terms of sensualization, foreignization of the East, but then to counterpose it, particularly with the Arab world in particular, it's become this grey, politically dead. People don't even fall in love properly. They're completely, you know, so that you can't get the emotional pulse racing. So that was another factor. Then with that, I was reading more and more Arab women writers in translation. Some of them wrote in French, some of them wrote in Arabic, some of them wrote in English. And there seemed to be these very kind of nuanced, diverse, exploratory, inventive ways of talking about issues to do with lust and sexuality and love. So you would have some very sensuous, but very subtly dealing with it, and some who would be more sort of provocative, maybe more shocking. And but it ranged, you know, it ranged. And there was also debates going on, you know, in terms of Arab women, in terms of the current situation, or most of the texts that you read, it's a question of looking at censure and what's prohibited and what is not allowed, and Arab men come out of this looking really terrible. So the idea I had was to put these voices together, the classical with the contemporary, who's dealing with these topics, what voices. It's a way of sort of showing how big, how diverse and how multifaceted contemporary Arab women writing is, and what is the tradition some of them are drawing upon, both as in terms of their consciousness of themselves, and it's just a sort of showcase, a sort of a different route in really to some incredibly talented and diverse writers from the Francophone and English-speaking parts, as well as those who are writing in Arabic, and it's sort of, you know, it's not a, it's just a curation of works on the topic. I found it fascinating and really eye-opening for me, and a real learning experience, both technically and in terms of an awareness of the history.
Great. Is this a good time for you to do your second reading?
Sure, it's not connected to that anthology.
No, but okay, so maybe the next set of questions, I suppose, that we wanted to talk about was really more about London, I suppose, and languages and your, you know, how London works in your you know, in your multilingual life, but also how London is part of your geography. So yeah, if you do you want to start? Yeah.
Yes. So my reading is set just a little bit else. Do you want me to read first, as an example?
I mean, you go if you want to introduce it, talk about it, please.
Yeah, I'll just talk about it. I mean, it was to sort of partly to juxtapose the other reading, which was a sort of anglicized character in the Arab world. This is an Arab character in the English world. So the character is Rashid, who's from Gaza. His parents are from the sort of the PLO sort of political aristocracy. He's had quite a privileged upbringing. He's returned to Gaza with the peace accord, and now he's in England studying and going to visit his English girlfriend's house. How long would you like me to read? I've got about 7 minutes. Oh yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's a description of the house. So Lisa's family house had been cushioned and soft with clocks that tocked and clucked and whirred into buffered surfaces. Her parents' movements were synchronized around the clock's understated commands and seemed to be conducted in complete isolation from the outside world. The heavy wooden front door automatically locked and was then manually latched after Rashid and Lisa had arrived, and it stayed that way until they left. The doorbell never rang, nor did the phone. Close to her parents, Lisa had seemed drunk, or at least very highly caffeinated. Her conversation was jittery and full of show-offy statements and brash confrontation, which was never followed through, but caved into simpering cuddles with her father and a chummy snuggling up of shoulders with her mother in the kitchen. Will you be getting changed for lunch? Her mother had asked as they stood in the corridor, seemingly unsure how or whether to greet each other. Lisa had chosen to wear one of Rashid's old sweatshirts, climbing boots, jeans, and a checked black and white keffiyeh that they had bought together in Gaza. No, should I? Of course not, dear. No, not if you don't want to. I was just wondering. Lisa's mother went back to the kitchen, leaving them with her father, who kept leaning his weight forward onto his toes, as though the pressure could cause him to omit something of great importance each time. Would you care for a little something, say a G or T or a sherry, perhaps? Lisa didn't say whether you are, unless, of course, you was like something soft, if you're observant, that is. And at this proposition, Lisa's father had braced his hands together at the knuckles and set his mouth in preparation for something truly horrible. Oh no, he drinks anything, Lisa put in. Anything. Rashid had not spoken and was silently wishing that he was wearing something else, but he only had one pair of smart trousers, which were far too light, and Lisa had laughed off a jumper Khalil's mother had given him for London. You can't wear patterns, Rashid, really. You look like a computer technician or something. So he had ended up dressed identically to Lisa, but uncomfortably with it. Lisa, however, seemed very pleased about the way he looked in her parents' house. It was as though she had bought some particularly gaudy piece of jewellery from a junk shop and could now, against the plain background, appreciate its particular panache. When her parents left the room, she leant over him and kissed him with her mouth, with hers in a pout, her eyes open, and with an air of hungry sexiness that he felt she must have copied from a celebrity. The G's and T's and wine went to Rashid's head. Lisa's father had grunted with satisfaction each time Rashid accepted another glass, but the food, which interested Rashid far more than the alcohol, was guarded jealously with a foot-long knife sharpened repeatedly at the table and a fork shaped like a witch's claw. The implement stood between Rashid and the meat and vegetables in the centre of the table. It was not that the meal had made any effort to entice him. It tasted to Rashid as though it had all been rinsed under the cold tap, but he was hungry and his allocated portion was insufficient. The drink had only stirred up his hunger. It came far from satisfying it. Would you like me to stop there or shall I continue a little bit more? How are you doing? So, and then I've got a little, I'll just read a little bit, which is the dinner conversation, which is very awkward if it's very sort of, even if you don't speak Arabic as a Palestinian, you'll have conversations like this all the time. And what effect will the recent attacks have on your situation? Lisa's father asked, as though the question had followed on from a detailed debate, whereas it had actually come from nowhere. When Lisa's father spoke, he focused on a willow tree at the end of the garden, and when he listened, he tipped his head to the side like a security guard receiving commands over an earpiece. It's a disaster, Rashid said. We were gaining sympathy for what was happening to us, but now no one's interested. They were trying to make out that we're the same with those extremists who have nothing to do with us. No one wants to know what we're going through anymore. It's a disaster. Lisa's father had carefully removed a line of fat that curled around the pale meat and moved it to the side of his plate with the tip of his knife to where a twin sliver curled around it, causing Rashid to think of the word spooning that Lisa had taught him. Yes, her father said, focusing on the rain moving in the hanging branches of the willow outside the French windows. I can see that. I can see how that would happen. And with that, Rashid and Lisa's father's contribution to the conversation was fulfilled. Talk now turned to the regatta, Lisa's sister's habit of driving with a clutch on, the unreliability of the men repairing the central heating, the mouse in the garage, and the office affair of the next door neighbour but one. I think I'll stop there. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Aamer, would you like to read your piece?
Yeah, unmute.
I said I'm going to cheat again because I'm going to read a story that I wrote a year ago before the pandemic in Urdu, and then immediately translated into English. And it was actually the first story that I rewrote in English from Urdu. It's very, very close to the Urdu original. But you can ask me what I changed in this story for an English audience. It was published in Critical Muslim, and I haven't actually, it isn't in a book yet. It will be in my next book. Whereas both the stories you're hearing were in my last Urdu books. I'm reading very recent work. This is entirely set in London. I'm reading the last section of the story. August. I went to the eye doctor yesterday, Murad told Sarah. He said I needed surgery on both eyes, 14 hours on the right eye under general anesthesia. And then I woke up, rubbing my eyes, thinking I wouldn't be able to see, and I really couldn't. Maybe it was dark, or maybe the sun was still overcast after yesterday's storm. I slept for a while, a restless sleep, and woke up to lightning and thunder and heavy rain. The after effects of LM's show, Sarah laughed. Murad had finally gone with Sarah to the LM exhibition at the Serpentine Gallery yesterday. It was Friday, and their last chance to see the paintings again together. The gallery was crowded, but Murad was so taken by the artworks on display that he was barely conscious of other presences around him. Several of the canvases in the first room took up an entire wall, blurred images in powerful shades of purple, red, yellow, midnight blue. They had titles like Exile, Anonymity, and Devastation. They were painted during the Vietnam War, I think Sarah said. Her eyes were pensive. She was stroking her right arm in its sling with her left hand. Murad had read in Sarah's brief monograph that LM was born in Kenya and had abandoned an art degree in England to go and live in the US with her husband. She'd become politicized there and taken part in anti-war demonstrations in the 60s. In 1970, she separated from her husband and went away to travel, teach, and paint in South and Southeast Asia. In the late 70s, she lived in London, where her daughter worked, for 3 or 4 years, before moving to a remote seaside village in Sussex, where she stayed alone and was almost forgotten. Lucilla came to London to take part in every political protest that mattered to her, Sarah said. She was nearly 83 when she told me she'd come to stay with me during the demonstrations against the war in Afghanistan. She was walking on 2 crutches, but was determined to march with us. I'd just started working on the book about her, but she died in her sleep 2 days before she was meant to get here. And then I went to her wake, where we sang and danced as she would have wanted. Nothing solemn or lugubrious. They stood in silence in front of an untitled painting, which from a distance had appeared to be a river at high tide. But up close, Murad saw that what he'd seen as a river was a panel of the piled up bodies of 18 or 19 youths, writhing, jerking bodies with black streams spurting from their lips and from their eyes, painted after the massacres of Sabra and Shatila, Sarah murmured. That morning, Murad had heard from 3 of his Kashmiri friends. 2 of them had left Kashmir after spending the Ramadan holidays and Eid with their families. Asghar was in Qatar, Murtaza was in Aligarh, Kamil was in London. He'd asked Murad for a story he'd sent a while ago for Murad to include in the Kashmir issue of a journal he was guest editing. Kamil wanted to read it at a protest gathering at the university where he taught, but he'd lost the file in his copy of the journal. None of them were able to reach their families. Telephone lines had been cut off 4 or 5 days ago. And as they stood silently in front of the painting, Murad was beleaguered by images of Kashmiri youths with eyes wounded by pellets in the events of 2016. Let's go to the next room, Sarah touched his elbow, from the last decade of Lucilla's life, where she saved from all the paintings she did. What she saved from all the paintings she did after the First Gulf War. She had macular degeneration by then, but she was still working constantly. They seemed to have entered a wood or a wild garden. Trees, the dense green of leaves and ponds, birds and branches, fish in ponds, tropical flowers, patterns of life in the womb of abstraction. The smallest painting was of a very pale green, shrouded in a whitish mist that only appeared when you were so close that you might even take it for a trick of the light. It was titled Eyes. The last picture in the room was half blue and half white, with a broad yellow ray dividing the blue and white spaces like a doorway to sea or sky. In the bottom left-hand corner of the canvas, the artist had painted in lowercase letters the words, "Before life, death." And there the exhibition ended. Sarah sighed. Murad felt along with her and all their absent companions. A lifetime's gleanings of disappointment and despair, scattered shards of hope, and gathered up fragments of happiness. "Let's go," Murad said. "My head's reeling and my legs stiff from walking around and standing so much." It was 6 p.m. when they left the gallery. The rain had darkened the light summer sky to a November shade of grayish black. They stepped over puddles. Neither of them was carrying an umbrella. "No point in having a drink in this ghastly weather. It's too early to eat," Sarah said, "but the cats must be hungry. When do you plan to leave for Karachi?" "Another 3 weeks. Oh, another 3. They left the park. Sarah turned left to catch her bus to East London. Murad crossed over to Exhibition Road and limped down the pavement that would take him straight down the entrance of South Kensington Station.
Thank you. As Vayu was saying, this would be the time when we actually all clap and sigh and sit back and hear your two beautiful readings. And what strikes me in two things strike me in both of them. One is that, London, there's London and then there's the elsewhere.
Yeah.
So, whether it's Kashmir or Gaza or Palestine, and very different takes on it. I mean, one is London as a place of doing politics, and the other instead of some, London as a way in which, sort of, or London or kind of British sort of particular people for whom, no, this is not a conversation that you can have. And maybe before we open to questions from the audience, I mean, this was, the significance geographies was another question that I had. So, in a way, already in your writing, you've brought us to the Gulf, to Kuwait, to London, to Palestine, to Karachi. It's so your so maybe, yes, maybe, I don't know if when she wants to put the question better, but how is your London linked to other geographies, either in your writing or in yourself? Or, I mean, is London just London, or is London always other places as well?
For me, both, because, the story just came to me in Urdu. It came quite spontaneously. I was finishing a book in Urdu, so there was probably an unconscious drift towards that. But why did I sit here and write a book that was set in 3 months, June, July, and August, and write in Urdu? It just came to me in Urdu. It was, the language that was in my head. Then I had just come back from Pakistan. And then I very quickly translated it into English because of a demand.
So
but yes, I think this is what an English friend actually commented about. She said, your head is always full of other places, and they're not just, Europe or Brexit, though there is Brexit in the story earlier on as well, and there's Bojo, and there's all kinds of things. But she said, your head is always connected with many other people and places that you're communicating with, whereas we tend to communicate with a few people around us. So I guess that's my answer. It's very simple. It's very pedestrian.
And for you, Selma? Actually, you were talking about something like this before, wasn't it? But also your experience of
London. I mean, for me, London is just is the most like home. I mean, I would say more London than maybe Britain, but just one, because it's my main language, so I can overhear people. Two, I feel very happy to be hearing other languages all the time. Three is that it's, well, whatever number I've got to, is that I've traveled so much. I've lived in 8 different countries, and in each of those countries, some of them are quite transient communities. So it could have been either because there was an expulsion, like with Kuwait, or because it was partly a sort of expaty crowd, like when I lived in Bahrain or when I lived in Cairo. And all of those groups of people have sort of, if they're not living in London, they used to come through London. London was a hub, and it was a place where you could form lots of sort of different identities for yourself according to those groups. For me, I think what I mentioned before is that the lockdown is quite interesting, because from being somebody who traveled quite a lot and had people traveling through London a lot, it's made me sort of see a kind of like pared away London. You know, it's like it's just the sort of I'm more with my monolingual Londoner friends now, which is it's just a readjustment. It's not good or bad. It's just it's for me to be part of a settled value system which has evolved without disruption in a way is quite new to me, you know, with social codes that I'm getting used to and stuff. So, and in my big books, to contrast the 2 pieces, I think London often comes across as a place of safety, you know, from political strife, and a place of where people can be engaged in some issues politically, where perhaps in other locations they can't be. And that's a great thing, you know, to sort of...
Funny little Pakistani friends of mine made an observation when he read this story. I had given him the proofs to look at. And he said, it's so funny that Sarah, whose identity we never know where she's from, and she's actually, you know, inspired by an American friend of mine, is looking at the historicity of the paintings and saying, this was painted here. She's an art historian, by the way, which you don't know from what I read. This is inspired by this is inspired by that. And he's looking at it and thinking of it in terms of the last year that he spent, or the last month that he spent. And he's thinking of Kashmir, though she died long before that happened. And then, yes, again, the story, I think, conveys that kind of degree of comfort one has in London as a place, because for me, London is not even London, but just, you know, a small kind of area around where I live. I'm agoraphobic, so Little Venice, Regent's Park, and even getting to Hyde Park is a trek for me. So as I managed to get to. So, you know, it's set in those places with which I'm very familiar. So when people ask me what home is, I always say, well, home is Little Venice, and the places I can get to easily from there. And everyone can see me here.
Yeah. Francesca, shall I ask my question about language and significant geography? So I had a question. If you think of language itself as significant geography, and given that both of you actually know more than one language, so how has multilingualism reshaped your personal geographies?
Selma, would you like to take that first?
Oh, it's quite a difficult one, because I'm sort of I definitely feel like a different personality when I speak other languages, and I like being those other personalities perhaps more than I like being my personality in English. I think the one thing that really frees me up when I'm talking, you know, French, or I have very bad Italian as well, or Arabic, but more so with the European languages, is that being in a different culture, I feel that you're deaf to, you're just a foreigner, so that you're freed from judgments, other judgments about locality or class or education or all this stuff, which is can be quite pernicious in England. And it's an immediate alienating thing that can occur. And I like also having it sort of like the gauze put over all that about the society that I'm in. I don't know, you know, what it means to be from a certain area of Bologna, or what their accent is telling me. I'm just taking them on how much I can understand them. And we have to speak to each other much more, you know, slowly and carefully, because obviously so there's a whole kind of courtesy and egalitarianism to dealing with people in second languages, I think, which I love. I just wish I was better at them. But then, so my understanding of this sort of more, because I'm not actually much of a linguist in terms of learning. I don't sort of take to languages as much as I would like to, as some people do, but my sort of entry point into Arabic particularly was political through my work, you know, when I used to do human rights, and then it evolved. Now it's more to do with love poetry, it's history, and it's a different nuance that provides a different vision of that world. Is that, yeah.
In mine here is an aesthetic question. When I wrote this story in Urdu and then rewrote it in English, I would like to know how people who are familiar with my English writing feel that the Urdu writing and then the translation back into English, in which I've made no effort to sound like my English self. I've just tried to convey what I was trying to say in Urdu, comes across. You know, does it sound like a translation? Because, you know, the concerns are exactly the same. The only thing I've changed, which I promised I was going to say, was that I mentioned Serpentine Gallery, South Kensington Station, and East London, whereas in Urdu it just says a gallery in Hyde Park. She took her bus in one direction and he walked towards the station. That's what I changed, because I knew that students or readers in this place, in this country, would like to know the specifics of where they were. That's, I think, very, you know, geographical, isn't it? Or I don't know what word can we use for it. And what's the word that one uses for mapping cities? It's one of, you know, those things. Obviously, in English, you map the city differently unless you make a very conscious choice to elide places. And
Cartography.
Cartography.
Cartography, exactly. Yeah. Cartography, yeah.
Interesting, yeah. So, Francesca, back to you. Unmute yourself.
Sorry. Should we open up for some of the questions? There's some in the chat and some more if you want to.
There's one that I thought we could pick up, and it is about Selma's early on
Comment about outsider status.
And she came back to that, to that later. Selma's comment about outsider status as a rich perspective to explore, right? I feel is a very important one for all of us. 1, 2, 3 generations everywhere. Yeah.
I don't know, Ferda, if you're there, if you want to add something to it.
Shall I mean, what I'm willing, shall I just, were you hoping for the questioner to come in?
But go ahead, you know.
But what I was just going to say is that if it's something that interests you, I mean, it's something I feel quite strongly about. I mean, it's not that I'm trying to erode those people who've been fortunate enough as to have, you know, Arabic so good that they can appreciate Shidyak, who I reference in that story, Acceptance. I don't think in my lifetime I will be able to do that. But what I feel for my generation and the generations down is this hybridity. And there's Michael Ondaatje writes about this, talking about mongrel literature and the idea of not having to sort of hang on to the idea of not being purely English or being English literature with, you know, sort of like the ethnic corner, but just being this idea of hybridity and well, not strict assimilation in the pernicious sense, but the sense that you are, you know, that throughout history you've had this layering of languages, and we're just doing it in perhaps a slightly more violent way because of the distances that are being crossed are greater, so that the clashes, or no, I don't want to say clashes of cultures, that sounds awful, but the differences, the differences are quite difficult to breach. But I think if you're the product, like I am, of a mixed marriage, it's something that's so inherent to you, is seeing how people can do this and how they can make it work, and how misunderstandings happen, and how people tolerate and put up with things, and you know, learn from each other and have to come around to a different point of view. Sorry, this all sounds quite sort of I don't know, hippie-ish, but I think that being an outsider also gives you that sort of comparative perspective on how to resolve situations, and it's quite freeing. It makes you feel sort of quite individualized, which I think is you know, it can seem like a problem, but you can view it as a strength. You have a mix and match approach to what you choose to engage with and love, and other things maybe you can reform them. And culture is always fluid, and you're just at the intersection so that you can make it your own, to your own shape. And it's a continuous process, I think, throughout life, doing that some way. So I talked a bit too much, sorry.
Not at all.
No, not at all.
And in fact, Verda said her mic is not working properly, so she...
Thank you for the question and for the interest. I agree. The Mongol literature and Dachi.
I wonder, Sarita, do you want to ask a bit more about the differences or the challenges of experiences of other tongues in different ways to our mothers?
It was more just the recognition of that. Both my parents speak different languages, and I thought it was really beautiful how it was expressed that because growing up, it's your mother that's nurturing, that's looking after you, so you're more having that conversation and the things of the home and the things of the daily life is the language that you speak, that you pick up, whereas the relationship, for me anyway, with my father is different. Of course, he was out working and so on. So my father's tongue, which is Swahili, is something that I didn't learn so well. It was more when I moved to Tanzania and lived there for a number of years that I was able to pick up the language and pick up, I suppose, acculturate myself to the language in a way that's very different to learning it and growing up here in London. So it was just more that I appreciated Selma pointing that out, the differences in how we experience our different parents' tongues. I thought that was really interesting.
Thank you.
I think one thing that for me, and I don't know if there are other questions that anybody else wants to ask. I mean, one thing that has, maybe we started from that, but we're coming back to the idea of languages as a sort of lifelong journey also, not something that you start off with necessarily and that's it, but that you're constantly developing, adding, and then depending on where you are, some get strengthened and some sort of fade more in the background. But also I think, I don't know, Aamer, if what you said was closer to what Wenqing was saying when she was saying, well, actually the languages, having lived in different languages, they kind of come together in you, or are they quite separate in you? I mean, I think that's something...
No, I think they come together much more than they remain separate. There are bits of them that do remain separate, yes, of course. You know, there's a sense of humor that I have in Urdu. I think that Shazaf addressed this quite well in her session. And it comes across better in my Urdu stories. Dialogue, when it's Pakistani speaking to each other, is funnier than it would be if I tried to write in English, etc. But no, I want to go back to something that Selma said in the question that was put to her. Yes, I think that, you know, much as I might feel comfortable in my little niche in Little Venice, I do continue to write about outsiders. That's what interests me wherever I'm writing about. Even if it's Pakistan, it's going to be people, women who run away from their homes, or, you know, wrestlers who are drug addicted and have to deal with the world around them, and all sorts of things, or people who miss another place or just feel out of place where they are. And in London, I tend to write about the kind of multicultural group that I live with, though I have very many English friends who are quite monocultural. They're never really monocultural entirely, probably more than I am. But they're not the ones I usually write about, unless it's to counterpoint what I'm trying to say in my stories. So the outsiderliness or outsiderness, however much I try to get away from it, always comes in.
Good.
And it doesn't have to be a linguistic one. Like, we don't know how many languages LM in my story speaks to. I mean, she's born in one place, she goes to another, then she paints in another, then she comes back to England where she started from. But her interests are always, you know, directed outwards. She extrospects even in her paintings. So.
Yeah. And I think for me, it's come to represent an adaptability. You know, a lot of my friends have had similar lives, and there's just this adaptability, this reinvention, this drive, you know, more to reformulate yourself, to adjust yourself to the new situation. All this stuff, it's sort of second nature. And I think that sometimes I can get a bit snobby about this if I'm with people who haven't. It's not snobby in terms of having a sort of affluence of life, because, you know, obviously it's been more disjointed. But if I see an inflexibility towards, you know, that kind of being open to new things. I mean, it's probably as much a personality type, perhaps, informed by the life that I've led and the culture I come from. But I think I like to sort of focus on the positives of this way of living. And to be really proud of it, and hope that my writing reflects that, and I hope that other people feel good in their skin and they don't feel that they have to, you know, why aren't I, you know, why are they focusing on that bit that's missing, you know, that why aren't I 100%, you know, such and such a kind of person from wherever it is, whether it's Taipei or London, you know, that model, because no model, I mean, we all know this, but no model is, you know, any DNA test will show up hundreds of, you know, most will, except for maybe island cultures, but a lot. I mean, I had 18 when I did mine. I mean, it's a richness that there's so many pernicious forces at the moment countering that with myths, which are you know, countering the idea of mixing, thinking about ideas of purity, which are, you know, I think which we have to counter in our writing somehow, and personally as individuals.
We're getting a question from Shazaf, which says, does any of us write at the expense of one language? Does anyone write at the expense of one language? Yes, Shazaf. I sometimes choose to write in Urdu at the expense of English, because then I'm either constrained to have my work translated into English, or write it myself in English, or rewrite it myself in English. So yes, sometimes Urdu just becomes more important. I don't know why. It's something fairly recent, but
I really like, I mean, I think what Salma is saying now is really important, isn't it? Going back, I suppose, to the idea of the hierarchy of languages, so that, you know, okay, English may be more dominant and so on, but you also want it to be open, isn't it, and flexible, and not then say, oh, because it's more, you know, because it's dominant, that means that a particular rigid model or a particular cultural model should be sort of accepted by, you know, become the model, as you say. You know? I think for me it's like this English which is aware of the other languages, you know, which, whether showing that or not, but knows that there are other language worlds around.
I think London is a good place for that. In a sense, London, you know, English is of multiple inflections, but also it sort of absorbs other languages, and you can hear it. And I like to speak on the bus I get on when I sometimes go home from SOAS, it's bus 29. You get on there and you hear English of different accents spoken in different ways. But you also hear people speaking different languages to one another. So one will be speaking English, another replying in Italian or French, and then Kurdish, Arabic, and all African languages come in.
Polish, Hungarian, also.
Yes, absolutely, yes. But I sort of wanted to sort of come back to this question of the sort of multilingualism and how we live our different languages and our different relationships with other languages. And I want to come and ask you a question, right? And I think, Selma, this is probably, you know, I would be interested in hearing what you have to say, given sort of like the different levels of your language, right? But when you inhabit a language, or you're inhabited by a language, let's say Aamer Urdu or Hindi or Farsi or English, I mean, do you feel that you're different people? let's say if I go to Jordan and I live there for a week and I hear nothing, I speak nothing but Arabic. I mean within a week, and that's because I grew up in Libya. I'm a total Arab, and I feel fully Arab, and I feel that I'm a full person. I'm not missing anything, if you know what I mean. So I want to sort of come back to that and think about that. Sort of, do you feel like you're a full person? Are you different persons, or how do you manage that kind of relationship with languages and language as a significant geography? And Selma, I'll come back to that.
Shall I? Yeah, I mean, I think
thinking about it.
Well, just one thing in terms of going back to what you were saying about the absorptiveness of English and how people in English are very, very used to people speaking it as a second language. I mean, less so now, but in the Arab world, I mean, particularly now I'm reading quite a lot about Iraq and the time of King Faisal the First, who was like sort of in the 1920s. And part of the idea of Arab nationalism is the Arabs are connected by their language. Language was so key. And when he was talking about Zionism, he was saying, are they Arabic speaking, these Jews? It wasn't the religion, it was the language, which are you in or are you out? And it's all to do with language. So when I go to the Arab world, my accent is quite good, and anyway, my accent is quite good. I kind of look the part, and my name is Arabic. So I start speaking, and everybody thinks, well, fine. And I love that. I love it. I feel a real kick. I feel really warm. And then after a while, I slip up. You know, they start thinking either I'm retarded because it's like I can't really explain myself very well, or that, you know, they think, you know, that there's this foreign label put on you, and there's suddenly a different distance. So although I can feel a warmth of being in the club on a level from having communicated some Arabic, I can't get to say what I want to say. So I feel more loved, but less understood because and less intelligent, a lot less intelligent. And I like playing with language in English, and I can never get, you know, I wouldn't be able to make a joke as much. It would have to be very reliant on gestures and, you know, facial expressions, etc., to carry off anything. You couldn't, I'm not at the level. And I think that can sort of, you know, exclude you. And then you turn, and then you do that awful, terrible sort of faux pas of switching over the language to English. And then the whole group has to change. And then you've spoilt it, you know, and it's like, why do we have to cater for her from the sort of, you know, because she hasn't bothered to learn from us? And, you know, it's a tricky one. It stops language learning because of the emotional. I think it's so interesting today for me to talk about this, because it's the emotional relationship that I've had with Arabic has really been much bigger than you think, considering how little Arabic I actually speak. That's, yeah.
Mine's a switching of cultural codes, because when I'm there and I speak Urdu, people just assume that I'm going to accept everything they're saying in Urdu. About culture, about society, about mores, about norms, about, you know, ways of belonging. And then suddenly they get a terrible shock when I don't. But the reason I left the country was that I didn't accept those mores. And there are lots of people who speak English who don't accept them. There are also lots of people who speak Urdu who are much angrier with Pakistan than I am, because I don't live there. But that happens. So, you know, there's a tendency to try to push me into a slot because I can't speak the language fluently, or certainly understand everything they say and more than what they say, and even help them with their mistakes, because so many of the people we speak to in Pakistan are not speakers of Urdu as a first language. They're Pashtuns, they're Seraiki speaking, etc., etc. So I tell them, no, that's not how you say it, that's how you say it. Or they ask me, you know, how does one put this? And I think it's the same in England, because of a certain fluency, of a certain ease in English, because of that, people just assume that I'm going to have all the same values as people in the West who speak in a certain way about politics and about the supremacy or primacy, at least, of European norms. Expect me to agree with them, and when I don't, and when I think of the world as one place and of literature as one body, and don't think of literature as being fragmented between what copies Western literature and what's indigenous and what's folkloric and what's primitive, and what forms belong to the non-novel, and how poetry is still effusive and exuberant in Eastern languages, but is restrained in Western languages, etc., etc. I just go.
So we always come back to the status of the outsider, right?
Yeah.
But it's,
you know, once you're an outsider, does one even want to cease to be one?
Yeah.
And it's not even an outsider so much as an onlooker. I think we become onlookers.
Like that.
But for me, it's in both cultures. I can't say I go home to Pakistan and feel, oh my God, you know, I'm in my nest, and then I come back to England and feel, oh God, I'm you know, distracted and alienated. It goes both ways. It absolutely goes both ways. The things I love about this place and things I love about that place. And I can't say I'm torn between them, but there are things about both that I also intensely dislike. So.
Yeah. I mean that, you know, but by saying that you feel full, right? It doesn't mean that you're not critical. That's not what I'm trying to say, you know. But yeah, but we always go back to the status of the outsider.
Much as I hate that term hybridity, I still think that, you know, Ouyang Baba is quite right when he said that for hybridity to analyze it, you have to look at the skull behind the mask. You don't just celebrate it; you actually examine it.
Francesca, back to you.
Yeah, so I think we've got, we should really wrap up. So if one of the goals of, you know, of this and the other session and today was to come up with different and multiple ways of thinking about, you know, how one is multilingual, how to talk about one's relationship with languages. I think we've got we had a lot on the plate, and I think without seeking to simplify anything or to reduce anything, I think it was thank you both of you for the wonderful readings and for the for a very thoughtful and very involved. I mean, this is really part. I mean, languages are a very deep part of our lives, aren't they? So they and emotions are very strongly involved, and they mediate our relationships. So thank you very much. So we now have a bit of a break, and the next session is going to be at 5:15, the final session, which is poetry reading with poets in English, Amharic, Arabic, and Hindi, all living in London. So please join us in kind of clapping silently to our speakers, and to and to all of you who've listened and stayed with us, and please join us again.